You went to the grocery store. Store, same list, maybe even fewer items than last time, and somehow the total was higher. You didn't buy anything extravagant, no special occasion, no impulse buys, just the usual: eggs, bread, chicken, a few things for the week, and yet you stood at the register thinking, did I miss something? You didn't. That's the part nobody warns you about. There's a feeling spreading quietly right now. It doesn't have a clean name. It's not poverty, it's not a crisis. It's something stranger than that. It's the feeling that money doesn't go as far as it used to. Groceries feel expensive. Rent feels expensive. Even the basics feel like they cost more than they should. And the strange part is, many of the people feeling this are earning more money than they ever have in raw dollar terms. The same paycheck, the same habits, the same general approach to life, and somehow the result is less comfort than it was a few years ago. People notice it first in small ways. The rent that once felt manageable now requires a conversation. The weekend trip that used to be spontaneous now requires a spreadsheet. The vague sense that you're working the same amount, maybe more, and yet there's less margin at the end of the month. And here's what makes it disorienting. Most of these people are not reckless. They're not buying boats. They're not eating at Michelin-starred restaurants every night. They're just living, normally, the way they always have, or at least the way they thought they always had. That gap between effort and outcome is what we're going to talk about. There's a story most of us absorbed growing up. It goes something like this. You work hard, you earn more, you build a life, and as your income rises, things get easier. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. The direction is upward. Pressure eases. Options open. You get a little more breathing room each year. That's the deal. That was always supposed to be the deal. For a long time, it mostly worked. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but the general pattern held. Rising income translated more or less into rising stability. Something has shifted. Because right now, millions of people are earning more than they ever have in raw dollar terms and feeling financially tighter than they expected. They got the raise, they switched jobs, they built the resume, they did what they were supposed to do, and the breathing room never quite arrived. The question is, why? Let's start with where money actually goes today, because the map has changed. 20 years ago, the major expenses in most households were relatively simple: housing, a car, food, utilities, maybe a cable bill. The cost structure of everyday life had a certain shape to it, heavy in a few places, manageable everywhere else. That shape has transformed. Housing has become the dominant financial pressure in a way that's difficult to overstate. In major cities and increasingly in smaller ones, rent and mortgage costs now consume a far larger share of income than they did a generation ago. In the 1980s, housing was expected to cost around 25 to 30% of your gross income. Today, in many markets, it's closer to 40 or even 50%, and that's for households considered financially stable. Then there's transportation. The average new car in the United States now costs over $48,000. Insurance premiums have climbed steadily. Maintenance, fuel, parking. What used to be a background expense has become one of the top 3 line items in many budgets. Healthcare is another. Premiums, deductibles, copays, prescriptions. Even people with employer-sponsored insurance face significantly higher out-of-pocket exposure than previous generations did. A single unexpected medical event can represent months of savings. Then there's food. Not restaurant food, grocery store food. The responsible choice. The one people make to stay on budget. Grocery prices in the United States rose roughly 25% between 2019 and 2024. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural change. And then there's a category that barely existed 2 decades ago: subscriptions. Streaming services, software, cloud storage, fitness apps, news, music, delivery memberships. Each one feels reasonable. Together, they represent an entirely new layer of fixed cost. The average American household now spends over $200 a month on subscriptions. Many people don't even know the exact number. The charges are small enough to disappear quietly into the background. The point isn't that any one of these expenses is outrageous. The point is that all of them exist simultaneously, and almost all of them have been rising. The cost structure of modern life has quietly accumulated weight in every direction at once. But the cost structure is only part of the story. Underneath it are mechanisms that are harder to see. The most visible is inflation, not the abstract economic concept, the lived version, the one where you buy the same brand of orange juice you've always bought and one day notice the container is smaller. Same price, less product. This is called shrinkflation. Companies rarely announce it. They redesign the packaging, adjust the labeling, and move on. The price stays the same. Your purchasing power quietly declines. Then there's what economists call the substitution effect. Official inflation measurements assume that when something becomes expensive, consumers switch to cheaper alternatives. In theory, that's rational. In practice, it hides part of the experience. If steak becomes expensive and people buy chicken instead, the inflation index barely moves. But the household that used to afford steak and now cannot has experienced a very real loss, one that doesn't show up cleanly in the headline number. And then there's the services shift. The modern economy has been moving gradually from ownership to access. Instead of buying software, you license it monthly. Instead of owning media, you stream it. Instead of paying once, you subscribe indefinitely. This isn't inherently negative. There are conveniences to it. But financially, the effect is significant. It converts large occasional purchases into smaller, permanent ones. You never finish paying. The cash flow never clears. And then there's the cost of living baseline, the quietest mechanism of all. 20 years ago, internet access was optional. Today, it's a utility. Smartphones were luxuries. Today, not having one can limit professional opportunities. Childcare costs have risen dramatically in many countries. Elder care, too. Services that previous generations provided within family networks are now, increasingly, paid services. Every time something moves from free to paid, the baseline rises, and once the baseline rises, it rarely comes back down. Here's where it starts to feel a little vertiginous. Modern economic systems are very efficient at absorbing income increases. When your income rises, something predictable happens. Your housing budget expands slightly. You qualify for a larger mortgage. The car you can afford becomes nicer. Subscriptions you declined before start to feel reasonable. This isn't weakness, it's the natural response to having more. You calibrate upward, but the market calibrates with you. Landlords know what professionals in your city earn. Lenders know what you qualify for before you've consciously identified it yourself. The systems around you are extremely good at capturing additional income as it appears. Then there's credit. As incomes rise, access to credit expands. Student loans, car loans, credit cards, buy now, pay later services. Each one feels manageable at signing. Together, they create a fixed monthly load that can quietly rival housing costs. The system rarely absorbs income through one dramatic mechanism. Instead, it works through dozens of small ones, quiet, incremental, often voluntary, each individually defensible, collectively relentless. Income rises, expenses expand, the margin stays thin. This is the point where people often blame themselves. They look at their bank statements, they find the subscriptions, they remember the dinners out. They tell themselves a familiar story, that if they were more disciplined, more intentional, more financially literate, they would have solved this by now. And yes, there is always something to optimize. Anyone who looks honestly at their spending will find something. But that explanation misses something important. The people feeling this pressure are not primarily the reckless. They are often the careful ones, the planners, the emergency funds in high-yield accounts, retirement contributions already automated. They followed the advice. They took it seriously, and the margin is still thin. That's not a personal failure. That's a structural signal. Housing costs are not determined by individual discipline. Healthcare pricing is not a personal budgeting issue. When millions of responsible households experience the same pressure at the same time, the explanation cannot primarily be individual. It has to be systemic. So where does that leave us? Not with a clean answer. There's no single villain, no single lever to pull. The forces behind this feeling, rising baseline costs, an economy that monetizes more parts of daily life each year, Wages that grow slower than the things wages are supposed to buy have been building for decades. They don't reverse in a budgeting session. But there is something useful in understanding them clearly, because the feeling that money goes less far today is not imaginary. The data supports it. Housing, healthcare, childcare, subscriptions, services that used to be free. The structure of modern life genuinely costs more in real terms than it did a generation ago. Understanding that doesn't fix the problem overnight, but it does change the nature of the confusion, because there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working hard, doing things right, and still feeling like the ground is moving beneath you, and not knowing why. The truth is, the ground actually has been moving. The system around money has changed, and the sooner we see that clearly, the better equipped we are to navigate it honestly. Even when honestly means admitting that this one is bigger than a spreadsheet.